Hi, I'm Gareth Kane, and welcome to the Net Zero Business Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jan Rosenow, Professor of Energy and Climate Policy at Oxford University. So, welcome to the podcast, Jan.
Thanks, Gareth. I look forward to this conversation.
And I understand your promotion to Professor is very recent, so congratulations is in order.
It's very recent indeed. At the time when we record the podcast, it's about a week old, the news. So when it gets aired, I guess it'll be a little bit longer, but yeah, very recent.
Yes, well, I've been following your social media for a long time, and it looks as if it's very well deserved because not only do you obviously know your topic inside out, but I think your ability to communicate quite complex issues to people like me is superb. So that's why I invited you on. So well deserved. But if that's your most recent news, should we start at the beginning? And how did you get involved in the energy field and the sort of low carbon energy field in particular?
Well, I have to go back quite a few decades actually into my childhood. My upbringing was very much influenced by my parents, who were both staunch environmentalists, and I founded an environmental group at age 8, very much dealing with local issues in the community and not so much with energy policy. But that was the starting point of my interest for environmental issues, sustainability, clean energy. And professionally, I started to work in energy in 2004. This was looking at the impacts of lignite mining in Germany and trying to understand the social and environmental cost of doing that, and then looking at alternatives such as renewables that will be associated with significantly less impacts. That's how I got into the sector.
So, how did you go from studying lignite in Germany to becoming a professor at Oxford University?
I took a rather unusual path in order to get here, I'd say. So I worked in consulting for a couple of years after my master's degree in London. I didn't really enjoy that at all. It was very much working on modeling and carbon footprinting and things like that. And then decided I actually wanted to go a bit deeper and specialize in policy, and did a doctorate here at Oxford in energy efficiency policy. Went back into consulting, but then spent the last 10 years working for a fairly small organization called the Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP. And RAP does a lot of work in the policy space. It's basically like a think tank, but also works very closely with policymakers, trying to design better policies to drive the transition to clean energy. And that was 10 years of my career. And I ended up running the European program, became vice president there. And in the meantime, have always published in academic journals, which is what you need to do in order to get the professorship. You need to have a consistent publication track record. And then that was enough to get me the job here at Oxford and ultimately the professorship. It's a whole bundle of things that you need to bring together. Grant funding is another, and engagement certainly helps as well. The public engagement that I still do. That was my journey to this this new role.
Yeah, fantastic. And the RAP project, a lot of the background reading I've done in preparation for this is the report you did in December 2024, Some Like It Hot, and I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes because I found it an excellent primer for many of the issues that we're about to discuss. So basically, electrification seems to be winning the race for decarbonising transport and our homes, but it's always been said that industry is a much bigger challenge because of the higher temperatures involved in many industrial processes. So perhaps you could expand on that and explain some of the core issues on moving largely fossil fuel powered high temperature systems to electrical systems.
Absolutely. And you're right, Gareth, that when I first looked at the industrial sector, I was coming to it very much from the perspective that it's almost too hard to abate. There's this sort of term that's been still being used very widely. It's hard to abate sectors, and in many cases, people mean it's impossible or very, very difficult to abate. And if you approach the industrial sector like that, you don't see that there's actually a lot of opportunities for decarbonization with existing technology. That is not necessarily easy to abate, but at the same time, it's not impossible. And I think a good lens through which to approach this is to understand that most of the energy use in industry is for heat. It's for process heat. That's where most of the energy goes. And then within this segment of process heat, you have a lot of different temperatures. So you might have some processes, for example, drying in the food industry, for example, where you need fairly low temperatures. So by low, I mean temperatures maybe below 100 degrees C or 200 degrees C. And then you have medium temperatures, maybe up to 500 degrees C, and then really high temperatures, maybe going up to several thousand degrees C. And segmenting it in that way makes sense because in each of the segments, you will have different technologies requiring different support and that are at different levels of maturity. So, for example, if we look at the low temperature segment first, which is the easiest, one would argue you can pretty much electrify all of that with existing technologies such as heat pumps. Large industrial heat pumps have been around for some time. They keep getting better. They keep getting to higher temperatures. Efficiency is improving. More offerings are coming to market. But then you can also do things like electric boilers, which have been around for a long time. They're sort of more like a drop-in replacement for maybe what you might have instead as a gas boiler or even a coal boiler. And that can be done with, of course, some capital expenditure and significant effort. But it's possible to do that in that segment of low temperature heat. And that covers a lot of emissions. That's about 30 to 40% of energy use and emissions of the industrial sector is focusing on that segment first. So I would argue focus on the low-hanging fruits, on the easy to electrify low temperature heat segment first, and then maybe think through the other segments perhaps as a sort of next stage.
Yeah. I find that very interesting because most of us think about heat pumps as delivering sort of 50 degrees centigrade water through your radiators at home, not 200 degrees centigrade. So when you say they're becoming more mature, how readily available is a heat pump to give you 200 degrees centigrade?
I mean, 200 degrees centigrade is pushing the boundary. Most models that are available on the market will not reach that. But there are some manufacturers that now state they can reach temperatures in excess of 200 degrees C even. And a lot of that depends on having an available high-grade waste heat source. So by that, I mean an existing stream of heat that you can utilize, and then you basically use the heat pump to lift the temperature level up to where it needs to be. It's very hard to do 200 degrees C if you just have ambient heat from the air, for example, because the lift that you need to then deliver is massive, right? You're talking 180 degrees C or something like that, which is the efficiency of the heat pump just drops dramatically the bigger that lift is. So if you want to operate it at a pretty good efficiency, you need a high-grade waste heat source. The good news is we have quite a lot of waste heat in industrial processes. So often in the same plant, you might have a cooling process where you have heat coming out at the other end, which is being extracted. And if you can then use that for maybe a heating process, you're actually just reusing the waste heat that you already have on site. So connecting waste heat with heat demand is key for heat pumps. Mm-hmm. And that makes them, I'd say, a bit more complex than just installing another boiler where you don't need to do that connection between waste heat and heat demand.
Yeah. I suppose there's scope as well, where if you have a cluster of industries that, one source of maybe even fossil fuel powered heat could be used and reused in this way by neighbouring businesses. Is that the?
Absolutely, absolutely. Or you might have a district heating network that provides you with steady stream of heat, and you can plug into that, and the district heating network might be fed with waste heat, at least in part. So there's many different options how you can run the system, and it requires a good understanding of where waste heat sources are, and how steady they are, what quality they have. But it's being done more and more places, and now see uptake of this technology. It's still at a very early stage. I mean, just to put things into perspective a bit, perhaps. So globally, I mean, the numbers are a little bit shaky because the statistics around this are not that solid. But roughly speaking, less than 5% of process heat globally is currently from electricity. The other 95% are almost exclusively from fossil fuels. There's some biomass in the mix, but it's primarily fossil fuels, gas, coal, oil, even are the main sources of where the heat is being generated from. So we are, we are a very long way from scaling these technologies. I think over time, we're going to figure out how to deploy them more effectively and in more places. But it certainly has been demonstrated in lots of industries, whether we talk about textiles, pulp and paper, the food industry, the chemical industry. Heat pumps have been successfully deployed in many different project settings.
Yeah, fantastic. And here in the UK, there's been a lot of controversy about the steel industry. And we've had various blast furnaces shut down, and people are jumping up and down saying this is because of net zero, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the interest is to shift from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, which are electric, but are only process scrap steel. So I was interested to see in that document, Some Like It Hot, that there are options for electrification of extraction of virgin steel or iron from iron ore, and then making virgin steel that way. So perhaps you could talk us through that other end of the market, the more difficult and controversial one.
And they're really high temperature ones, yes. And I should be completely transparent. I'm not an industrial engineer, chemical engineer. I can't explain exactly how the technologies work to make virgin steel from electrical processes rather than relying on blast furnaces. But what is the case is there are now several pilot projects. These are all small scale, right? They're not massive projects yet, but there are several pilot projects where it's been demonstrated that it's possible to make virgin steel with electricity and direct electrification. So that's quite eye-opening for most people, and I include myself in that category because we assumed for a long time that virgin steel has to be green hydrogen or something like that. Yeah, it's not going to be electricity. That is clearly being challenged by some of these pilot projects that have demonstrated that actually there might be a pathway. We are, of course, a long way from commercializing those technologies, seeing significant scaling up. Well, that could change. There's no reason why that couldn't change. It's just important, I think, to when I look at the industrial sector, to segment it and really think through what are the low-hanging fruits, focus on that now with policy, like the no-brainers where it really makes sense. And then maybe the more tricky technologies, they need a lot more support to get going. And we're more talking about demonstration projects, pilot projects, more R&D. But it's certainly the case that there are electric technologies available for a lot of processes where most people still think we need to combust some sort of fuel, or we need some sort of feedstock. There's definitely opportunities for electrification, even in those segments that are quite hard to decarbonize.
Yeah. I suppose if they're at that level, we can't really compare the costs of, you mentioned hydrogen, and I am a hydrogen skeptic. And I think from experience and I think being proven right, largely by trying to compete against a supposed hydrogen economy in Teesside for many years that still hasn't come to fruition. But do we have any indication of whether steel making through a hydrogen-based process or through electrification, which one would win out economically?
I have not seen any sort of levelized cost comparisons for that segment. We have a paper currently under review, which hopefully comes out later this year, which is looking at the levelized cost of heat in industrial processes, but for the lower temperature segment. And I mean, it's not a surprise that hydrogen is the most expensive option in that comparison. That's not just in our analysis, but also other analysis in China and in the US that I have seen shows very similar patterns. So it tends to be the case that heat pumps come out as the most cost-effective technological solutions, and then you might have electric boilers, and then hydrogen and biomass sit somewhere in between. It's still challenging to compete with gas. I mean, that's the main reason why we haven't electrified so much of process heat is because using gas tends to be cost competitive against all of these other technologies, including heat pumps often, because electricity prices are not consistently at the ratio where they should be in comparison to gas prices in Europe and globally. So it's not an easy sell. It's I'm not saying that electrification of industrial processes is a win-win today. It is in some sectors, it is in some technology segments, but it's certainly more challenging to make the case for industrial electrification on economic grounds alone compared to when you look at electric vehicles, for example, which now clearly have demonstrated that they can be at a lower total cost of ownership than internal combustion engine vehicles. So there's work to be done.
Yes.
But then innovation will do its wonderful thing of bringing down cost, improving technology. And ultimately, what we need now, I think, is a bit of a policy push that will really help us to find the best possible solutions.
And am I right in saying this is known as the spark gap, the difference in cost between using gas and using electricity?
Indeed, yeah, that's a shorthand that people tend to use for it. And it's such an important factor. It's not the only one. And again, I think that's where industry is perhaps a bit more complex than buildings or the transport sector, because, and we talked about this before, even understanding an industrial site, understanding where there might be waste heat source, what the heat demand is for an industrial process, connecting the two is often not trivial and requires expert knowledge. And therefore, even if your spark gap is low and the economics stack up, there might be other complexities involved in industrial processes that make this more challenging than just buying a new car or installing a new heating system. So there's a lot of other barriers. I mean, grid access is another significant barrier for industrial facilities in many locations. Getting grid access for electrification can be a showstopper. If you don't get grid access, even if the economics stack up, you can't do it. And what do you do as the operator of that facility? Just going to stick with fossil fuels. And we see that in some countries already.
Yes. And we've had previous guests on, Paul Glendinning from Northern Power Network, talking about grid access and how there are changes happening to try and simplify the connection process and allow the local energy companies to pick and choose rather than take everything in a queue system. That sounds exciting as well. But I was listening to a rival podcast, the Bloomberg Zero podcast, and they did a small series on obstacles to net zero. And one of the first one they had was transformers. and even getting enough transformers to electrify some of these heavy processes sounds like a real challenge, and one that surprised me. We always talk about skills and to a lesser extent things like supply of copper or rare earth metals, whatever it may be, but transformers was quite a shock.
Yeah, it's transformers. But it's also other components. Like getting compressors that can deal with the temperatures required. For high temperature heat pumps, for example, can be a challenge. There's not that many suppliers yet, and that makes it more challenging. So it's not the same supply chain maturity that you see in other parts of the clean energy sector, simply because of the size and the very highly bespoke nature of it. So we need to find a way of standardizing more of these changes to industrial sites, which is difficult because each site is different. That makes
Yes.
standardization harder, and makes it potentially more expensive and more difficult compared to compared to buildings and transport.
Yeah. I suppose if this move starts, then the demand will start to encourage both innovation that you mentioned before, and maybe even standardization. If people think, well, I can sell transformers now, so I'm going to create standard sizes that you can get much cheaper than a bespoke one, or something like that. So I can see how that particular sort of restriction could lift over time.
Yeah, and you see that with, I mean, electro-thermal storage is one of the technologies I personally get very excited about because it has that ability to be readily deployable. It's scalable. It's standardizable. So companies like Rondo or Craftblock, for example, have been making headlines for a while now, deploying electro-thermal storage technology, which is pretty standard in terms of how it's being built. But it can be, you can have pretty much any capacity if you have the space for it, and it can provide heat at really high temperatures 24/7, and then the electricity that you're using that can be managed very smartly, taking advantage of low electricity prices. So it's a really interesting option to convert electricity into usable process heat at the right temperature.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the technologies that's currently maybe a bit overlooked, but could really scale in the coming years.
So just perhaps you could explain in layman's terms how that works.
So most people think of batteries as storing electricity, right? They might think of either small batteries or very large batteries. Grid storage is now well established in places like California, for example, Texas, but it's also starting in Europe. So that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is storing energy as heat. So you convert electricity to heat and store it in a heat battery. And there are different ways of doing that. But what Craftblock, I think, is using is a manufactured pellet, which is essentially put into a very large box and heated up with electricity. And then you store the heat in that material. I think Rondo is using some sort of brick that they manufacture from clay. And the same process. You heat up the bricks with electricity, and then you store the heat in the material, and you can extract it on demand. So it's a very different technology, but the advantage of it is that the materials that you use could be very cheap. There are even companies using heat batteries where you use sand as the medium, and that's totally different compared to electric storage, where you're relying on metals and potentially much higher costs. So that's why I think it's interesting. And also you can store energy for longer, which is another big benefit. It's less difficult to store energy for long periods of time in the form of heat, whereas with electric batteries, really it's not very practicable to store electricity for many days or even weeks.
So I assume these solids can store the heat at a higher temperature than water. You know, if we think about a water tank, a hot water tank in our house, I assume these pellets and bricks can go to the higher temperature, so you can extract the temperature at a higher temperature. Was that a good
Much
guess?
higher.
Yeah,
Much higher. I mean, you're talking more than 1,000 degrees C, and yeah, even higher than that. So you can have much higher temperatures, and that makes heat batteries, I think, a pretty interesting option. Yeah, because you can get to these very high temperature levels, which is required in a lot of different industrial facilities.
yeah. Going back to the report you wrote before, just at the end of last year, um, of the different industrial sectors for electrification, the one that stood out as the most difficult in the very good diagram on that was chemicals, where it was down to 75% not electrifiable. I was wondering why chemicals is so tricky compared to these other materials that we've been talking about, like steel making, etc.
Yeah, so with the chemical sector, it's very important to understand that most energy that is being used in the chemical sector is actually used as feedstock for chemical processes. So, for example, fertilizer production, it's not used to create process heat. So the term that people use is non-energy use. Yeah? That's the term. It's used for chemical processes, and direct electrification is pretty much impossible there because it's, electricity can't replace that unless you go indirect. So you could make green hydrogen via indirect electrification, but that's a totally different question. So that's why direct electrification is limited in the chemical sector. And there's actually a lot of processes that cannot readily be electrified in the chemical sector that use energy for process heat. So especially specialist chemicals don't require very high temperatures necessarily and can be made at fairly low temperatures. So heat pumps certainly have a place in the chemical sector. And when you look at higher temperatures, steam crackers that make base chemicals, you already see some pilot projects. For example, BASF in Ludwigshafen have successfully started the first electric steam cracker in April this year. I think it was, and that's or last year. I think it was last year, and that's demonstrating that it is possible. So there's definitely space for electrification in the chemical industry, but the main reason for that big chunk of non-electrifiable energy use is because it's actually not used for process heating.
It's the feedstock, petrochemicals basically. You need the hydrocarbons to actually make them. You mentioned earlier in your career you focused on energy efficiency. So what were the big takeaways from that experience in terms of industrial energy efficiency?
Yeah, efficiency was my entry point, pretty much into a lot of the work I do now. And when you look at industrial decarbonization, it's highly relevant, of course, for a number of reasons. I mean, we have this big debate in Europe and the UK about competitiveness and the cost for industry, and I'm often frustrated that the debate focuses primarily on energy prices. It focuses on the inputs, and it's important, like no doubt, the cost of electricity and cost of gas, and that's important. That makes a big difference to competitiveness. But what really matters is not just the cost of the input, it's how efficiently you use that input and convert that to an output. You could have a highly inefficient factory that's using very cheap electricity. Then you compare that perhaps to a very inefficient factory that uses a lot of cheap electricity. You have a totally different cost for the production overall. And the efficiency really matters. So my main point is that energy efficiency has huge impact on the competitiveness of industry. And we know that when we do comparisons globally, that actually European industry is fairly efficient, per unit of output is fairly efficient compared to China, in particular. The other aspect here, I think, is if we move from combusting fossil fuels to electrification, there are some significant efficiency gains to be had. Even electric boilers, let's assume they're 100% efficient and not 100% exact, but maybe 99% efficient. Compare that to a gas boiler. You're getting about a 20-25% efficiency improvement immediately, which is significant. And if you throw in heat pumps, of course, that efficiency improvement is much, much larger, perhaps a factor of maybe 4 or 5 more efficient compared to using a gas boiler. So there is a significant efficiency improvement by moving from combusting fossil fuels and process heat to electrification.
Yeah. And one of the things I think is often missed out is that we ignore the fact that, plant inevitably needs replacing at some point. And one of the, I mentioned the 2 blast furnaces that shut with, or no, were kept open by the government on very controversial political circumstances that beyond the scope of this podcast. But one of them was built in the 1930s and one of them was built in the 1950s. And I'm not a steelmaking expert by any means, but the engineer in me thinks, well, surely those technologies must be inefficient because we're certainly talking about almost the age of steam and steam trains and whatnot. So it always surprised me that those blast furnaces hadn't just been replaced as a matter of economics, and that the cleaner technologies are not only coming in with less carbon, but they're more modern and presumably take less maintenance and less cost to keep running just because they're brand new. Is that a fair statement to make, or am I running off at a tangent there?
I think it depends really on the exact application, and it's the running cost. I mean, if electricity is multiple times more expensive than fossil fuels, it's quite difficult to see a business case for technologies that are not super efficient. I mean, heat pumps, I mentioned before, because of their high efficiency, they can deal with that. But if you move to other electrification technologies, it's a lot harder than to compete, even if the equipment is quite old, but it's often written off and you don't have to factor in the capex. So I think it's also useful to distinguish between new facilities and retrofitting old ones. I mean, new facilities should be ready for net zero, right? They should be using technology that is clean and ideally be highly electrified. For existing, you have to kind of go with the life cycle of some of the equipment if you don't want to incur significant costs because you're writing off the equipment earlier than the natural lifetime. The good news is I think there's plenty of opportunity to do that. If we focus just on making sure what is replaced with clean, that's already a significant market and would be a good entry point.
Yeah. And as soon as we talk about energy efficiency, I always get worried about the rebound effect, or what's known as Jevons Paradox, after the Victorian industrialist who realized that the more efficient that equipment became in the age of steam, the more coal ended up being consumed, not less, because we just used it more. So I always worry about a focus on energy efficiency as a form of cutting carbon emissions, because I'm not sure it necessarily does. But I suppose what you've been talking about is being more efficient by switching to electricity. So you get the economic benefits of the efficiency and the clean benefits of the carbon benefits of the lower carbon impact if we use clean electricity. But does sort of Jevons Paradox get discussed in energy efficiency circles still?
It still comes up, and of course, there is a rebound effect. I mean, there's no doubt. We know that, and it's been studied in great detail by people like Steve Sorrell, who's at Sussex University. He's done a meta review, and there've been other meta reviews of the evidence. And yeah, we know there's a rebound effect, but it's not backfire, which would be more than 100% using more energy than before. It just means your savings are diminished because some of the savings are basically not materializing because you consume more. But if you take the example of, let's take a really simple example of someone's house, right? If you insulate the walls and suddenly you cut your heat demand by 50%, well, you might not want to increase the indoor temperature by spending all that money on run your heating system more. There's a limit how much comfort you want, and if you already had comfort levels that were very, very high to begin with, you're not going to have a massive rebound effect. And then the only way how you end up with a really big rebound effect would be if you spend all that monetary savings on energy. But how likely is that? You might spend it on some services, on products that involve energy, but not 100%. So I think, rebound effects exist, but they rarely approximate, they're not approaching 100% in most applications. So I think it's been overstated as a problem. And it's an interesting question whether it was the efficiency that was driving industrial growth, expansion, energy demand, or whether it was just the innovations that allowed us to do that. And efficiency was just a function of that. I mean, that's a longer historical discussion, but I'm always a bit wary of people saying, oh, we use more energy because of efficiency improvements. I think the story is a bit more complex than that.
Though I did do a calculation once. In the early 2000s, I drove a diesel car, and a lot of people were swapping to the Toyota Prius, and I calculated if I did, I would save, I think, £200 a year on fuel costs, which was exactly enough for a flight to New York, which if I took the flight to New York, I would end up doubling the carbon footprint that I originally had on the car. So there are economic things, but I think some of that, there's an aviation issue anyway, because flying is far cheaper than any other way of polluting the planet. So I think that is a problem. But as you say, you can't. There's only a limit to how much you can fly. Some people are up against the limit, I suppose, but others don't not. Which sort of takes us on neatly to policy. And in terms of the shift to electrification and the accelerating the maturity of these novel technologies that we've been discussing about earlier, what are the main avenues the government, or a government, not necessarily the UK government, but a government could use to promote those technologies, close the spark gap we've been talking about before, speed up grid connections, whatever those things may be? Do you have a sort of wish list of policies that you would like to see?
Yes, and it's a long list, but I'll just give you a few, I think, key levers. So yes, electricity price is critical. It's not the only piece, and that's to a degree a political choice. Taxation, where you allocate policy costs, that's a political choice. So governments have some degree of control over that, and in my view and view of many others, should use it wisely, and ideally use taxation to incentivize the kind of behavior and technology adoption that we want to see, and you disincentivize the behavior that we don't want to see. That's not always the case. So that's number one. I would say number two, have a specific incentive and mechanism to actually scale industrial electrification. There's not many programs like that. You will see there's some old-fashioned energy efficiency programs for industry. There's some broad decarbonization programs, but very specific industrial electrification programs are fairly rare. I'll give you just three quick examples. One is a very new auction scheme that the European Union is introducing and is now running a pilot which gives 1 billion euros for industrial electrification projects in a competitive auction. So that's an interesting one to watch. It's the first of its kind globally, I believe. We also seen something similar in Germany, the carbon contracts for difference scheme there, or the Klimaschutzverträge, how it's called in German, which is basically similar to renewables and contracts for difference. You have a scheme that's rewarding carbon savings in the industrial sector, but that's also open to a lot of different technologies, but industrial electrification is one of them. And then finally, there's a similar program in the Netherlands called the SDE++ program, which provides operational support, hedging the risk of fluctuating carbon and energy prices and helping with the upfront cost. And that also supports industrial electrification very, very strongly. So that's number two, having an incentive program in place. And then I think the wider issues around grid connections need to be solved actually by regulators and system operators, not so much national governments, perhaps, through allowing smarter ways of getting grid connections, things like non-firm grid connections, shared grid connections, making sure there's incentives to use the grid more smartly. So that's a whole big debate in of itself, but it's one for regulators primarily, I believe, and the system operator. So that's the number three. And maybe I give you just a final one, which is around making sure that we have assistance for companies that consider electrification, because often they don't have the in-house knowledge how to even start, which technologies to look at. And that's an area where government can provide things like engineering assistance programs, making sure that there are intermediaries that help interested customers making the leap from using fossil fuels on their side to electrifying some of their end users.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like there's a raft of things that can happen. I was interested that, obviously you've got a lot of experience with what's happening in Germany, that those policies are being implemented. Have they been going long enough to see if they've delivered any tangible results?
Very recent. None of these instruments are particularly mature. And a review also in the US that was done a few years back didn't find a single mechanism specifically for industrial electrification. It's very early days. We now see some momentum, things are changing, but it's fairly slow, and we don't have lots of evidence yet. Which instruments work best? What are the impacts? We're at the beginning of a transition here, rather than at a midway point where we can sort of assess, like in the electricity sector, right? We now know, okay, feed-in tariffs, what's their impact? Contracts for difference, how do they work? Renewable obligations. There's decades of experience in more than 100 countries with industrial electrification. We're nowhere near that, so it's very early days.
Right. Okay, we're coming close to the end of our time here, and I really appreciate what you've told me so far. I suppose a slightly more philosophical question to finish up with. If you could go back in time to your 8-year-old self setting up this environmental group, would you tell him that you were optimistic or pessimistic for the future?
I always lean towards optimism, because I think without being optimistic in some way, it's impossible to do this work and make a contribution. If you're genuinely pessimistic about the direction of travel and your ability to have any influence on it, then I personally wouldn't be able to get any motivation for the kind of work that I do, because what's the point, right? So I think being optimistic but also realistic at the same time is critical. But lean towards optimism and lean into that I think is the way to go, because the people who change things tend to be the people who have optimism that change is possible.
Fantastic. And I think on that positive note, I should thank you very much for joining me today and diving into this fascinating and crucial topic, because as we say, these are supposedly hard to beat emissions, and it's good to know. It makes me more optimistic that are at least potential routes to do that decarbonisation. So thank you for that, Jan.
Thank you, Gareth. Great conversation.